In this crazy world, we have a lot of questions. This show will help find those answers. Top Secret News is a show dedicated to bringing topics such as UFOs, abductions, implants, Men in Black, Area 51 underground bases, disclosure, weather manipulation, cryptozoology topics, and so much more. Host Christina George is no stranger to the airwaves and will be your host. Now, your host of Top Secret News, Christina George.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Paranormal Connections radio show. Let me just turn all this off because my phone is going crazy right now all of a sudden. We are back this week for part 2 of a very popular show we just did recently. And so for people who haven't seen the promo for this week, we are back with Gary Heseltine. We're going to be doing part 2 of discussing his book, Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest Incidents, 42 Years of Denial. And we were talking about this last show, and wow, we got to the end of the show and there was so much more to talk about. It was so interesting. So we decided to bring Gary back for a second part to this. And hey, everybody, nice to see you. Nice to see you. Thank you so much. Hey, Chris. Hey, Ellen. Christine, thank you guys for coming. Again, if you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get right to them. With that being said, let me go ahead and just bring on our guest. Hello there, my friend. Welcome back for part 2.
Hi, Christina, and thanks for having me back on so soon.
Oh, I'm glad to have you. Hey, Christopher, thanks for joining. Yeah, our last go around a few weeks ago, we got just kind of into the heart of some really good stuff. And then all of a sudden it was we ran out of time.
Absolutely. So, there is so much information in the book. It's impossible to do it in 1 hour, let alone 2, to be honest. But I'm appreciative that you've asked me back to do even more.
Absolutely. Well, and I think too, originally when I had my show, it was a 2-hour show. Then it went down to 1 hour. So, and even on the 2-hour shows, back when I was covering, this whole story back in the years ago, I think we had you on a few times there too. And those were 2-hour shows. And, there's so much even more information now than there was back then. So yes, I could probably have you back to back to back. Plus, included with all of the questions that you're getting and, different things. So we'll start with part 2 and, get as much information as we can out there. And I just want to let everybody know that actually tonight will be the last live broadcast on this network for Top Secret News. That being said, a lot of people have been messaging me wanting to find out, is the show still going to continue? And my answer is yes. So I will be producing it myself. Back in the day, I did both shows myself, but just due to my health and stuff, I had to take a break from both of them. And, here I am. If you guys are, want the broadcast, I am happy to keep going forward and doing the show. So we may actually, because so many topics on this side of the show, paranormal, I can usually bust it out in an hour. But this show's, it's a little different. There, usually the stories are very intriguing and, there's a lot to share. So we'll go with that. Let's see. Yeah, Christopher. Yeah. So I think we may be going back to the 2 hours. Okay. Somebody's not signed into Facebook. Popcorn Soda. I'm here to hang out with this kick-ass show. Well, welcome to the show. Thank you so much. Hey, yeah, Lynn. Hey, you made it on time. So we're glad to have you. All right, Gary, let's get right into the nitty gritty. So, we were talking about the book last show and trying to think of where we we left off. Do you?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of the main interviews
Right.
with Adrian Bustinza that corroborated the original Larry Warren account. There was the Steve Langero with the sighting of the nuclear beam coming down, or the UFO shining a beam down into the nuclear bunkers. We covered the fact that there were, in the conclusions, 17 different sighting events in the conclusions of the book. But I kind of drawn up a list of things that we didn't cover. So that's maybe the easiest way to do it. And literally in the hour, you kind of go to the main interviews, but there is so much more. For example, when we talk about the one of the key witnesses after Larry Warren, who was obviously the original military whistleblower, I put a lot of credence by what Sergeant Adrian Bustinza said, and obviously I've already explained that he corroborated that Larry Warren's account from all those years ago, from late 1982, was accurate. But there was a lot of other things involving Adrian Bustinza that we didn't know, and one of the things that he'd said, which we mentioned in the first show, was that he'd had 2 nights of UFO experience. We knew he'd been involved in the famous Holt night with the Holt audio tape, but he said that the Larry Warren event, from his perspective, was another night, and what looks like a 4th consecutive night of activity. But what I didn't have time to fully explain is that when I was interviewing him about the Holt night, which would be night 3 in his schedule, night 3, the 27th into the 28th of December, he says some things that are very interesting that, in a sense, he'd never spoken about before. And when I had this 4.5-hour transatlantic phone call with him, he really was concentrating hard, and he was retrieving a lot of new information or old information, but remembering it, as it were. He came out with something, a new sighting that nobody had ever heard before. And what he said was that on one of the occasions where he was what was called the NCOIC, which was basically a mobile patrol, and he would be what we would call a gopher. Go there, get me this, get me that. And so he went in onto the bases trying to get light-holes, pick up people, bring them to the forest. And he did this on several occasions. And obviously when he would go back to the forest, he'd park his vehicle up at the staging area, because that's where all the vehicles had to stop, because there was no path further into the forest. So that became like a focal point. He would then meet up with people, then get told, given orders, go get me some more light-holes, blah, 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 go get me some more people. And he went away and did this. So on what we think is the Holt night, night 3, he'd got this roving commission where he kept going and coming back, getting out, going and coming back, doing different things. So every time he came back to the forest, there was an opportunity for something else to happen. And on one of these occasions, while he's talking to me, he says to me something that I'd never heard before. He said that he was ordered to form a security cordon of US Air Force security police officers and create a line of approximately 20 policemen, for want of a better word. And you know, like when you're looking for a knife that's been discarded, you often see film clips or TV clips where all the police officers are in a line, side by side, and they move forward very slowly, looking down to see if they can find in the undergrowth the missing knife, the gun, or whatever, or any evidence. Right. Well, effectively, he was told to do this. Well, nobody's ever mentioned anything like this. Colonel Holt, in his audio tape, never mentions any of this. In his book, he never says anything about this. But here he is, from Sergeant Adrian Bustinza's point of view. He's telling me about what is effectively a new event, because it goes on to have a UFO connection. And what he said was that he was ordered to to get about 20 US Air Force security policemen. So, I mean, these are his numbers. So again, it gives you the hint of how many people were about, because this is not everybody. This is just 20 of X amount, but 20 or so are in a line, positioned within eyesight. They're not shoulder to shoulder. They're maybe many meters apart, but they're going to do a single forward line search into the forest. And don't forget, in the forest in 1980 was very different from how it is now. And at that time, it was vast undergrowth. Obviously, the trees were different, a lot taller, but they were told to form a line and then proceed slowly into the forest. And they'd not been told why. He was just told to do it. And because he was a sergeant, he was organizing that. So they all spread out. So you can imagine maybe a line of 20 over perhaps maybe 100 meters. You know, he's got 50 meters one side and 50 meters, 10 on one side, 9 on the other, and him being in the middle, kind of thing.
But what are they told they're looking for? I mean,
they're not, and that's kind of one of the frustrations he had, and also the frustration was that all of their weapons at this stage had been taken off them. So go in a line and work your way through the forest, and yet you are defenseless and you've not been told why. So this is pretty curious. So they're obviously, and it's night, it's the middle of the night, it's dark, it's must be pitch black apart from your torches. None of the light holes worked once they got close to the forest, even though they'd worked on the twin bases and had been checked at the motor pool. By the time they got to the staging area, they wouldn't work. They'd maybe start up for 3 or 4 seconds and then they wouldn't work again. And the people would say, well, have you checked the fuel? Yes, of course we'd check the fuel, but they weren't working. So they were pretty much reliant on their own torches, which in a pitch black forest, and I've been in that forest, at night when there is no ambient light, it is pitch black. You wouldn't see your hand in front of your face if you didn't have a torch. So imagine people are going out in a line. They don't know what they're looking for. They've not been told what they're looking for, but basically just proceed forward slowly in a line. And he does this. Now, interestingly, he says that he felt incredibly vulnerable. And if you put yourself in his position and that of the other people, you would feel very vulnerable.
Right.
You know, you're essentially a soldier. You would normally have a weapon if you thought you may experience something, whatever. And there they were, totally defenseless, just a torch, and they're going forward. Now, interestingly, what he said was that at one point, as he's moving forward in the forest, and there's a lot of nervous chatter amongst everybody because they're all frightened and they're all thinking, what the hell are we doing? Suddenly, he feels, and the way he described it to me, he feels as if he is pushed from behind and he falls down to the ground in the forest as he's moving forward. But interestingly, it's what he said next. And what he said was that as he fell down to the floor and he, in a sense, went to stand back up, as he was about to stand, he realized that he was underneath like a film of fog. Imagine, say, a fog at 3 foot height that you couldn't see when you were standing. But when you fell down, and then you were about to stand up, he said, I looked up and I could see that there was a line of fog at about 3 foot. And above my head, it was like I was underwater. That's how he kind of described it. So can you imagine? That would be really weird. And he described it as a yellowy, greeny fog. Now that plays a part in what turns out to be the Larry Warren account of before the craft had landed, there was a fog, a circular patch of green mist stroke fog just hugging in a circular patch in the farmer's field. Well, indirectly, he was saying pretty much of the similar thing, but this time it's a layer in the forest. And had he have not fallen, he would have not gone underneath it. And it's only as he looked up, he could see like a layer, like a membrane of fog. And he thought that was really strange. And he was well used to fogs, and he'd never seen any kind of greeny yellow fog like that. So as he gets back up, people are still very nervous. And then all of a sudden, as they're moving forward through the trees, they see a light beneath the canopy of the trees that starts to zip around, and everybody's looking. So this is a new sighting that nobody had ever heard about. And then he said, as we watched it, and everybody's kind of like, what the hell is that? Then, literally a couple of minutes later, one object suddenly becomes 7 or 8 objects that are flying through the forest. And he describes it like Christmas lights, that they're all whizzing around. Now, nobody had ever talked about this, and that lasts for several minutes. And then they shoot off. So this is, again, something that's overlooked. But this is another sighting. This is one of the 17 that I list at the end of the book. But interestingly, one of the other things that comes out as well from a number of people that's really important is the 2 shifts that generally were involved, C shift and D shift. Effectively, one worked what we would call in the UK an afternoon shift, say from 2 or 3 in the afternoon till 11 p.m. at night. And then a night shift would come on. Well, they call their night shift the mid shift, which is a bit confusing in English terms. But essentially, you had an afternoon shift. That's the simplest way to look at it. And then a night shift. Now, literally, we're talking maybe 40 personnel to cover the twin bases, mobile patrols, and protect the inside the weapon storage area at Bentwaters. So you maybe have 40 US security police officers per shift. And then you would also have a contingent of law enforcement. Now, these were not wearing combats. These were essentially military policemen in military uniform doing policing things. Like if there's a fight on the base, they'd go and investigate. If it's a drunk driver on the base, they'd investigate. If there was a drugs raid on the base, they'd do the policing stuff. So you maybe had a contingent of another 6 to 10 of those. So potentially you had maybe 50 people on shift per shift. Now, what's emerged through the book is that 3 security policemen have said that they were on the afternoon shift, but when everything started to kick off in the forest and strange events were being seen, they were then ordered to go into the forest, and many of them were ordered to go into the forest, but they weren't allowed to go off duty at 11 p.m., which they would ordinarily do. So what that means is that they then would work what's called a double shift. So they work in not only an afternoon shift of 8 hours, but they then began to work the night shift because there were events going on in the forest, and they needed essentially manpower, forgive the expression, manpower. And so you now have a dynamic that says that a lot of these people who were on the afternoon shift did not get off until, say, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So they'd done an extra 5 or 6 shifts. But what that actually means is that for a few hours, perhaps from 11 p.m. until 4 or 5 in the morning, there were in excess of 80 to 100 US Air Force security police officers on duty. And that way, many of them could be dispatched to the forest because it was unknown events. And clearly somebody had said, we need people in the forest. And this is borne out by Steve Longero, who I mentioned in the first interview. He's the guy inside the nuclear weapons storage area Bentwaters. When he's new on shift, he's walking around with an experienced airman inside, on the ground, inside the weapons storage area. which is the most fortified and heavily secure location on either bases because it contained tactical nuclear weapons. And he basically said, and we mentioned it briefly in the first show, is that he is walking around with an experienced airman. They see a UFO outside of the perimeter fence that then shines a beam into the nuclear weapons storage area, into the bunkers, and then does this grid-like search all the way along perhaps a 200-meter stretch of what are nuclear bunkers, as if it was doing an inspection. Well, that object turns off the beam and then goes out towards Rendlesham Forest. And because he was new on shift, he was effectively supernumerary. They didn't need him, and there was a call for things are happening in the forest, so we want as many people to go out into the forest. So he was taken off the weapons storage area patrol, which would ordinarily never happen, to be one of those that was dispatched to the forest because there's clearly something going on. We need extra bodies, as it were, to go into the forest. So that's unusual in itself. But interestingly, when he goes out there, and we're not sure about which night that is, I think this is potentially the fourth night. I think this could well, Steve Longero's account could well fall in to the second night of activity that Sergeant Adrian Bustinza had been involved in, which is the night with Larry Warren. And the reason why I say that is because he is taken off the weapons storage area into the forest. And when he goes into the forest, he is with approximately 10 or 15 other US Air Force security police officers. And they are taken, according to him, out into the forest by Sergeant Jim Penniston, which is very odd because Sergeant Jim Penniston, who's become well known because of his first night involvement with John Burroughs, the first night landing, if this is now maybe a potential night 4, he is saying that when the UFO left switched off the beam and went off into the forest, he's taken from the weapons storage area, go out into the forest. And he hears Sergeant Penniston on the radio monitoring the object going into the forest. And when he gets to the staging area in the forest, he sees Sergeant Penniston, this is his account, not mine. His account is he is with 10 to 15 other US Air Force security police officers, and they are taken to the original first night landing site where the 3 depressions were, if you remember, the John and Jim sighting. And the person that takes them, according to Steve Longero, is Jim Penniston. Okay, well, there's a kind of a problem with that because Jim Penniston has never admitted that he's involved in any other night other than his first night. But he's not the only person that says that Jim Penniston was involved. Adrian Bustinza says that on the night he's involved, Jim Penniston's involved. Very odd, because supposedly after the first night landing event with John and Jim, according to Jim Penniston, he was given 6 days off. Now, strangely, John Burroughs, who was with him, didn't get 6 days off, as far as I'm aware, but Jim Penniston did. So in theory, he should have been at home with his wife.
Well, yeah, shouldn't he have been on vacation? How could he be at another incident taking other people in?
So again, it throws up, but you're governed when you're taking interviews, you're governed by what the witness is saying. I can't fit things to fit my narrative. It's their account. So you have to go by their account. Now, they may be mistaken, but they also might be accurate. And maybe other people have got stories to tell as to why things haven't been mentioned. And if you read my book and in the conclusions, I say that the case has been, in my opinion, controlled for about 25 years. The narrative has been controlled effectively by 4 people.
Right.
John Holt, Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, and Nick Pope. Those 4 people are essentially in every documentary and have pretty much control the narrative. And I think that's wrong because all these other people that I'm mentioning, they don't get a look in. And when they come out with their accounts, they're like criticized, no, that didn't happen, but they're immediately attacked. Now, that's not the way it should be. If you've been involved in something unique, everybody should be saying, right, well, okay, it's 42 years on, it's confusing, we're never going to be that accurate about which days or whatever, but people should be welcomed. And instead of being welcomed, a lot of new witnesses or witnesses that weren't new but were there, their accounts are often vilified straight away by Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, and Charles Hall. And I find that odd, and it's not productive for the case. So it strikes me that there may be agendas at play. But anyway, suffice to say that when Steve Longero is taken to the first night landing site by what he says is Jim Penniston, and he's with these 10 to 15 others, they too see an object in the forest under the canopy of trees for about 10 minutes. It's just this sphere just watching them, and then it shoots off. So this is again another sighting that has emerged through re-interviewing certain key witnesses. And so it kind of all ties in the fact that this was far from a certain people have tried to say that the staging area was calm and you just wait there and we'll go off in the forest, and then when we get back we'll see what's. It wasn't. I think it was very chaotic. I think that the vehicles that were parking up, people were getting out and like, well, is this an exercise? What's going on? They didn't know that things were going on. Most, until they experienced it themselves, would just assume that there's some kind of incident going on, whether it be a crashed plane or some kind of military exercise. And it's only when they got there that they saw that everybody's kind of like running around like a headless chicken. And that's the way kind of Sergeant Adrian Bustinza put it, that this is far from a calm situation. And like I say, if you are keeping another shift on, then that's a lot of people, and a lot of people are being sent to the forest. Well, why? Clearly things were happening, and clearly they needed extra people perceived for maybe a threat or in case of some other eventuality. It's all very murky. But the key thing that's emerged is that on at least one of what I think is 4 consecutive nights, 2 of the shifts, in a sense, became one shift with potentially 80 to 100 people for several hours. The afternoon shift had basically worked many hours into the night shift. So I think that's important. One of the other things that we didn't really get a chance to talk about in the first show is that something else that's emerged, which was at least 2 people confirmed, military witnesses confirmed, that routinely the radio channels that were used, and it wasn't just one, there were several, there were potentially 4, but often it was 3. There'd be the command net, the law enforcement, and then there'd be security police. So in a sense, those were the 3 dominant ones. But what emerged was that all were routinely recorded. Every transmission, every radio message was recorded on audio tape, on the big reels, as it were. You kind of have this vision of old computers and putting a big reel on and a long strand of audio tape. It was like that. And several people, military witnesses, have said that they were involved in actually changing those tapes. Now, you think about that when we look at this very, very famous case that's been shrouded in so much controversy. That is evidence that was potentially available and may still be available. And we'll talk about other evidence that may be available as well. But this is really important, because when I spoke to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, he was the 3rd person that said, yeah, those recordings were made. And he said, I know that for a fact. I said, how? And he said, basically, out of the blue, several years after the event, he received an anonymous envelope, doesn't know from who, obviously anonymous, and it contained 3 audio tapes. And the 3 audio tapes with one from each of the 3 channels that I've just mentioned. And so he had physical evidence at one time. Now, there is a downside to this, is that for a time, Adrian Bustinza had collected as much evidence as he could, including these 3 audio tapes. But imagine if we had access to these audio tapes. So he's really confirming that they were routinely recorded, and he had 3 copies. But he said many years later, because his father worked for the government in a like a military capacity, his father was getting a lot of heat because of Adrian's involvement in this event, and his family were being surveilled right from the start, from days after the incident. When he was interrogated, he was speaking to his family, and they were saying, you know, we're worried about your dad's job, and there's people watching the house. Well, it caused a lot of family problems, I think.
Right.
And he'd kept documents, anything he could do with the event, he'd kept it all in a hold-all. But one day he kind of, like, I think, had words with his family, and he was so fed up of all the hassle that he was getting that he went out in the garden to a fire pit and set fire to it all. And whilst it's frustrating from an evidential point of view, if you look at the human side of that, you can understand that. You know, you're given a hard time, you just want to get on with your life, and this is years afterwards he's getting hassled. So at one point he said, I regretted it almost immediately. He said, but I burnt everything that I collected, little documents, shift rosters, all things that would have been really great, valuable evidential tools now to see who was on shift, names of people, etc., etc. But it also included these 3 audio tapes. So we know that those audio tapes were routinely recorded, and nobody, like Colonel Williams, who was responsible for the twin bases, and Deputy Base Commander Charles Holt, never ever mentioned this. And yet Jim Penniston mentioned this on the night of the Woodbridge conference at the 30th anniversary in 2010 in Woodbridge. So he's also one of those that said, you know, it was routinely recorded, and it was. So we've got several people confirming this, and one person, who a military witness who I spoke to, said he was actually, part of his duties was to go at a certain time to this building and then change the audio tape. So in a sense, we've got multiple corroboration. But think of the evidence that would be on. We wouldn't be having these discussions about what happened on that night, what date was it, who was involved. We could hear all the interactions potentially.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about other missing evidence. Now, when Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, when Airman Ed Kabanzak, when Sergeant Jim Penniston were interrogated, and Larry Warren, several of them had said that they made statements, but the statements that have come out in the public domain, of which there's 5, and are very poor statements, they're saying that they're not the ones that they'd actually written. And from Adrian Bustinza's point of view, he said when he was interrogated, and we'll talk about his interrogation, and I think I mentioned it in the first shot, how it made him feel, and he wanted to actually go absent without leave, AWOL. He wanted to run away from the Air Force because of the terrible way he'd been interrogated and given a hard time, and really made to feel like he was a criminal. It was disgusting. But one of the things that he said was that the evidence that comes from missing documents, and he said, I asked for my statement, and I did a 3-page statement, and they said, yeah, you can have it, but they never supplied it to him. Well, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation have totally and always denied any involvement in the Rendlesham event. They just didn't do anything. And yet multiple people say that they were interrogated, often given a really harsh time. And even Colonel Holt has admitted in various interviews that many of the men were subjected to harsh interrogation treatments. I mean, Jim Penniston says he was given sodium pentothal, truth serum, and I think Larry Warren said the same. So what you're saying, so clearly some agency was interviewing them, and the most likely is the Air Force Office of Special Investigation. They were the Air Force police detectives, as it were. They didn't wear uniform; they wear suits and whatever. Several people say that they were interviewed by more than one team of agents. Larry Wong will say he was interviewed by several teams. Adrian Bustinza, Jim Pennison will say multiple interviews that he had given a hard time. So there clearly were a number of agencies, but clearly I think from the military witness testimony, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation were involved primarily. Now, at that time, I'm led to believe by the military witnesses I've spoken to that all of those interviews were audio recorded. So, where are those tapes?
Right.
Of course, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation saying, look, we're not involved, which is ridiculous. And it always has.
And also, everybody's professing that this never happened. So,
correct. We're talking about a known event.
Right.
A lighthouse.
So, it reminds me a lot here in the U.S. of the Roswell incident.
Yeah.
Very similar. And it was anybody that tried to come out and speak about it. I mean, and also we're talking about a big space of time when, this all happened with Rendlesham Forest. It was a time that if you did, betray what they would seem the government by, divulging any information that you shouldn't be, then yes, you're not only you, but your family. I mean, they would make it so bad that, people would want to commit suicide or, they just wanted it to stop. And if that meant don't talk about it anymore, they were more than happy to do that. But it's such a different time now. So it's like people who have all these stories, yes, if they could only see in the future to know that, all these years later, people in our own government would be coming forward. People would be almost heroized, instead of villainized for coming out with information like this. They probably would have, yes, held on to it. But I could absolutely understand why they would get rid of it and just want to forget it, to be absolutely honest.
Absolutely. And it was very much a different time. It was still the Cold War, and they were under a threat. Now, imagine the vast majority of the airmen involved in these in the Rendlesham events were maybe only 19, 20, 21 years old. That's very young. Most were single, and you suddenly find yourself caught up in events that supposedly don't exist. You're seeing strange objects maneuvering through the forest, doing weird and wonderful maneuvers, and yet this is something that you're not allowed to speak to. You're not allowed to tell your wife, your girlfriend, your family, etc. And if you do, you're under the threat of going to prison and or fine. That's the world that it was, and I can well identify to that because of my work with police officers or with the Proof Force Police Database, because the primary reason that stops people coming forward publicly is two things. Primary reason is a risk to their career if they come forward, and two, the risk of ridicule, which for many decades, and the stigma that was created since the Robertson panel in 1953 to debunk everything, and anybody who said it was just crazy kind of thing, they're very powerful tools. Now, if you say to somebody in 1980 and you're in the military, you will never talk about this again, then almost certainly for many, many years, you don't, or the vast majority of didn't, because they feared, one, for their career, and feared for persecution, and nobody wants to lose their pensions and things like that, but that was the era then, and I only wish that it was like now. But even now, as the climate in the States has changed a lot over the last few years, and of course we've just had a witness congressional hearing. We've had the likes of David Grush giving testimony, Ryan Graves and Commander David Favor. They're almost heroes if you know the subject well. And they are heroes. David Grush. A lot of people, I read, UFO Twitter and things like that, and they just, a lot of people still don't get just how good a witness this guy is. This is a guy who was cleared up to presidential briefing level. He was the guy that took the presidential briefing on UAP, the documents over to the White House, and then hand them over to the president's staff, who would then brief him accordingly. But he was the guy who had the security clearance to take those documents. Now, that's the highest kind of level you can get. So when he said he spoke to 40 people over 4 years, and many of those subsequently, who were first-hand witnesses, gave testimony after he'd given testimony to the Inspector General, you know, many of the first-hand witnesses who had seen bodies and recovered craft and had been involved in retrieval and tried to re-engineering programs, many of those people have given testimony. And yet I still kind of think, well, you know, is this guy telling the truth? Well, this guy's under oath. This guy was at the risk of 5 years, I think, for perjury in the States, if you perjure yourself at a congressional hearing. So, you know, and he's under, he's bound by legal documents as part of his complaint to the Inspector General. So this is a guy who's as good a witness militarily that you're ever going to get. And so a lot of people, when you hear people just making frivolous comments, it's a bit frustrating, because this is a guy who was up to presidential level, and he knew people who were directly involved, and many of those have given testimony. I mean, we've digressed a bit, but what I'm saying is we now look at him as somebody like a hero, especially if it leads to a disclosure, and these first-hand witnesses coming forward publicly in due time. That would be fantastic, and we would look at him as a hero whistleblower. But generally, for whistleblowers over many decades in this subject, it's been harrowing. And Larry Warren, I would attest to that, because Larry Warren was that whistleblower. And we spoke before coming on air, and I think he's going to be coming on the show soon. But his life was made hell, and you know, certainly as soon as Colonel Holt retired, Jim Peniston retired, John Burroughs retired, then he was open season, and his account was then thrust up into the air. No, we don't remember that, blah blah blah. Instead of just saying, look, you know, it's a complicated event.
Yeah,
they chose to attack. No, it didn't happen. Especially Colonel Holt was very, very critical, and still is. But what I'm saying is, you know, generally whistleblowers, it's not good for a whistleblower, and you know, so full place for him to come forward, because without, and I highlight it in the book, there was several quotes by people over the years that basically said, without Larry Warren's account, the story really would never have come forward as it has, and we're still learning stuff. But you know, Larry was to be applauded for that, and he's been out on his own and been vilified. And we again, prior to coming on air, we talked about the several years where in recent years he was being attacked left, right, and centre, and I was being attacked because I said the evidence supports Larry Warren being in there. The fact that Steve Longero was at the same training school and saw him in the forest on one of the nights, which again makes me think that Steve Longero is involved on the Bustinza Warren night, because he says he's there at the staging area, and he's there, and I didn't know him well, not the big drinking pal that Charles Hudson, but he said I knew him. We've done all our training together. And if you're in that environment, it's your first tour and you're young and you're thinking, what the hell's going on? If you saw a friendly face, even if you didn't know them that well, but if you're at training school, that would be a friendly face. You'd be thinking, oh, that would be a great memory trigger. And I think that's important. So he's there. Adrian Bustinza finally comes and says, yeah, Larry Warren was closer to the craft. There's 10 or 15 around this translucent craft. That there are, according to Warren, it's entities. According to Adrian Bustinza, it's silhouettes, it's life forms. There is something there, that it's been filmed, corroborated. You know, Larry Warren was the only one who said it was being filmed, and then Sergeant Adrian Bustinza said it's been filmed. So on motion picture footage. So this is a great corroboration, and finally, but it's such a contentious issue because clearly this second landing in the field was what you weren't supposed to know about. You were never supposed to know this, and hence why Colonel Williams said, no, I wasn't there. Colonel Holt said, no, that never happened. Aliens, that don't be ridiculous, kind of thing. But it was literally hide in plain sight. But now we've got this corroboration. Why would two people? Even down to the fact that Adrian Bustinza said, yeah, I saw the British police in the forest on the night I was involved. On one of the nights I was involved. Larry Warren had said, I saw the British police there involved. They were stood back away from this event going on in the field. So all denied by everybody senior. But it's their accounts, and who's right, who's wrong. But it's been made to be antagonistic, and it shouldn't have been, because everybody's account should have been accepted. And what are you going to gain? Do you become rich and famous by saying, yeah, I was a witness? No, you're more likely to be vilified if you're saying something that certain people don't like. So there's nothing to gain. So when somebody does come forward, they should be applauded for coming forward. And I still think there's lots more information out there. But I know time's rattling on, and I think you want to get Larry on probably now, do you?
Oh, he's not coming on. He's going to come on another
show.
Show.
Right. Oh, he's not coming into this show. All right. Okay. Well,
we're going to have Larry because, again, after I had you on, I mean, I was so excited at the fact that, there was corroboration, because, I mean, I was one of the people who absolutely saw the attacks, and not only the attacks on Larry and you and others, but even myself, just for covering the topic.
Oh, absolutely.
For even believing him, and I'm like, we did a lie detector, the voice analysis test he passed, and they tried to say, oh, that was fake. And then, he did the lie detector, and they said, oh, that was, it was always something. So I was great. It was so exciting to hear all this information. And so, yeah, he came on my show, along with you guys back when all this was first coming out.
4 years ago.
Yeah. And then he got so much grief. Well, so many people got so much grief and so much harassment. He really kind of just got out of the limelight, the media, everything. He has his own little private group that he runs, and, he does not do interviews anymore. So thankfully I have good enough connection with him that when I asked him, he said, Christina, I don't do this anymore. And if it was anybody else asking, I'd say no. But for you, I will absolutely do it. So I'm definitely looking forward to having him on.
Yeah, I mean, that's good because in a sense, he's a very good speaker. He's a charismatic speaker on the radio, and he's a great storyteller, for want of a better expression. He's a very good at whether it be on video or film or audio. He's got a great voice for that kind of media.
You know what he's the best at, though?
Sorry?
You know what he's the greatest at?
What?
He's not a liar. And now, we know. Now, for everybody who swore because there was nobody to corroborate him, I mean, that's why I want to bring him back on. It's just another show to that's right. He's finally, the cover has been, taken off, and it's shown that, he was, everything that we were saying, everything he was saying was true all along. And I'm with you, Gary. I think that as time is going on, and I think that we see more people in the hearings and, and just whistleblower, more people coming forward, I think that you're gonna get even more information and more people who will eventually be willing to talk about, which will probably open a whole nother Pandora's box of even what their experiences are, because it sounds like everybody's got kind of different experiences.
I am certain that there are a lot more accounts to come forward, and we know from records that Lieutenant Bruce England, who had a sighting with Munro Neville's, and who was also involved with Holt's team in the forest, who saw multiple objects, he has never gone on the record. We know that Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, whose story I told in the first show, run off the road by a UFO, and then the whole incident covered up by the US Air Force for 42 years. Nobody knew it until the book came out, and that was thanks to Michael Stacey Smith. But you've got Sergeant Robert Ball. He did a couple of TV interviews very early on in documentaries and then has never been seen since. Well, we know he's involved probably maybe 3 or 4 nights of activity. I think he's got great stories to tell if he's still alive. I don't know. I've tried to trace him, these kind of people, and you can't find them. But if they're out there, if Captain Mike Verano, who was one of the shift commanders, was one of the senior officers, and who actually supported the story by Larry Warren, and had said that he was in the vehicle with the base commander Gordon Williams when he drove him to a waiting fighter jet, and he was carrying Colonel Williams was carrying a top secret kind of satchel, and he said, what's in the satchel?" And he said, "It's film of the UFO." Now, according to Sergeant Adrian Bustinger and Larry Warren, he was there at that second landing. And this was motion picture footage. This is not still photographs, as some people have tried to say. No, and Captain Mike Verano has said on a couple of occasions in print that he drove in there, asked the question, and he was told it was motion picture footage. So we kind of know that footage happened. And one of the interesting little things that came out through a MUFON researcher called Ray Boucher, who did great research between 84 and 86 and did a lot of the early interviews. He got familiar and friendly with a lady called Ann Turner, who was the Pentagon Freedom of Information officer. And she eventually told him that she'd heard military pilots, just chatting about that they'd seen film of the Rendlesham UFO. So that added further corroboration. And yet she said, when I checked my records at the Pentagon, there was no evidence of a film. There was nothing apart from the memorandum. So I think it's the kind of greater story is that, and why it was so controversial is because they didn't want to admit in 1980 that there'd been some kind of communication, some kind of field event where multiple senior officers had seen this second landing, that Colonel Williams was there, and according to Larry Warren, there was this silent face-off with 3 entities floating beside the craft. Now, and it was all being filmed. So can you imagine that had that have gone public, if that had a story had got out, or that film had emerged accidentally or released or whatever, right, that we'd probably be living in a different world now, because you'd have had the evidence of a craft, you'd have had the evidence of entities, you'd have had, it was on film, it was motion picture, and it's not still. So the fact that I am convinced that video probably still exists, but it'll be locked away in a vault somewhere, probably never to be seen again, or certainly not in the public domain. But do I think it existed? Yes, I do. And in the book, I actually highlight about 15 or 16 kind of corroboration markers that say the event in the field happened. So it's not just 2 or 3. There's probably 15 or 16 anecdotal markers that says that something happened in that field, as well as the military testimony of those that I've already mentioned. So we're touching on things. So when we're talking about missing evidence, and here's an interesting thing that came out in the book, which I wasn't aware of until I did that deep dive, is that we all know that the story broke in the News of the World in the UK in a big tabloid headline in October of 1983 called UFO Lands in Suffolk, and it's official. And the journalist who did that piece also was in communication with Colonel Holt, it seems. And I found that as I did some delving, I came across 4 people, independent of each other, who said that Colonel Holt had been in negotiation with the tabloid newspaper, News of the World, to sell his story, his UFO story, prior, key thing, prior to the story emerging. And the only thing that he'd said was, I don't retire until he didn't retire until 1991, so 11 years after the event. And he said, I can only go public once the story, with the story, when I retire. Now, inadvertently in early April, May, I think it was April of 1983, 6 months before the big tabloid headline, the memorandum had appeared for the first time to American researchers, who then sent it over to British researchers. But it emerged in America first, largely through Larry Warren, because and it's in the book where people have said it's only when Larry Warren said, "I'll put my name to that event happening," and they then did another Freedom of Information Act, that this document suddenly surfaced. And I don't think anybody really knew it existed until that point. But that's when it existed. But it's at that point there that the negotiations with Colonel Holt are taking place with the same reporter who broke the story in October. And one of the four sources, ordinarily I wouldn't have gone with this story in a book unless there were multiple sources. Well, I found one and I found two, and I thought, oh, no, I need more, three. And then the best one is by a British astronomer who's a skeptic called Ian Ridpath. And Ian Ridpath, in a letter to a little-known UFO publication, I'm aware of the time, but it's a good story. He wrote in and corroborated and said, yes, I was present at a lecture given by that journalist who said, yeah, Holt was involved in trying to sell his story before the big headline. And I thought, well, this is from a skeptic who actually plays a part. Ian Ridpath is the astronomer who came up with the supposed lighthouse theory. Yeah, so he's a very prominent guy, but he's a skeptic. And for him to write into a UFO publication and corroborate that actually the reporter had said it himself to his audience, I thought, well, that's good enough. So again, you now think about controlling the narrative. Clearly, at one point, Holt was prepared to sell his story, but it suddenly came out, the memorandum, and the news of the world said, no, we can't hang on to this for 11 years, basically, till you retire. It's going out. And he tried to pull it and whatever. But that's how the story broke. But how fascinating that we now look at the public figure of Colonel Holt, who I worked with for 7 years. Don't forget, I had a close relationship online with him for 7 years. That he, prior to, and I didn't know this, and he never told me, one of the reasons why the relationship ended, because he was holding stuff back. But that to find that, don't you think that has a bearing on how you look at Colonel Holt? He was actually prepared to sell his story. He's never mentioned it since, never mentioned it to anyone. It's not in his book, nothing. So he has created a whole new persona, and yet early on he was prepared to sell his story. And there are 4 independent corroborations to that. I find that fascinating, because I now say that he's involved in controlling the narrative. And this gives context that says, I wonder why.
You know, it's crazy. That's the investigator in you, you know, to really stick with this story, because boy, it took a long time for the true players to really show their true colors. And
I thought I knew the case well going into that deep dive, but I found stuff out that I didn't know, and I'm pretty certain that nobody else knew. So that's what's come out in the book. All the reviews by researchers and the readers who've done reviews, they're all saying it's such a thorough thing, and it's all corroborated and given references, etc. Little on interviews that I found that I thought the public should have. Remember, there was no pre-publicity with the book deliberately, because I wanted to get the truth out for the public, not for me. I wanted to get the truth out. Who writes a book, a big book on a big case, and doesn't promote it? I didn't do anything, because I wanted the genie out of the bottle. I wanted that information out there. And that's been corroborated and proved to be the case, because everybody's saying that it works so well. And most researchers are saying very clearly it should be deemed as the definitive book on the case. And Don Schmidt wrote the foreword, and I was humbled by his words, who said the same thing. But, you know, the tie-up with Roswell is not lost on me, because Roswell's the most famous case in history. Many people think that Rendlesham is the second most famous case. So when he agreed to write the foreword, I was very flattered. And when I finally saw his foreword, I was very humbled and thankful to him.
Absolutely. Well, you've done a great job. I mean, this has been a long time coming. You've been investigating this story for a very long time. And, I don't know anybody who's put so much time and effort, into really being a fact finder and, really waiting it out so that you could get enough information, enough confirmation to put this out. So again, personally, I appreciate that what you've done, because there's not a lot of people who do that. So, well, with that being said, we are at the end of the show, guys. Gary, thank you so much for coming on again for part 2. It's always love to have you on. And, we'll keep in touch, because I think that there's still going to be so much more that in the future comes out, and, we'll have to get all together and talk about it again.
I'm sure it's not the last of our conversations. I appreciate you having me back on.
Absolutely. And everybody, make sure to go out and get Gary's book, Non-Human. Where can they find it at?
It's only available on Amazon. So Amazon's in pretty much every country. So just put in Amazon.
That's right.
And it's Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 years of denial, because that's what I think it is. None of the cases can be explained in terrestrial terms.
All right, everybody. Well, make sure to go out and get that book. Show him some support, as well as this topic. And again, I know everybody kind of watches this at all different times after the live show. So please make sure to share the show review and send it out to everybody and your friends, everybody, so that everybody can know a little bit more about this. I mean, again, a lot of people know about this story, but I was surprised how many people did not know about all the updates. So this is a great book to get them. And if you want a little quick recap, you can watch the show. With that being said, again, I want to thank Todd and WLTK DB for allowing me to be on the network during this time. I want to wish Todd great success in everything he does. But for everybody following, all you'll need to do is follow my Facebook page or the Top Secret News page on Facebook, and you'll be able to see all of the shows. And it'll also be on the Paranormal Connections YouTube channel. So with that being said, I will see you next Thursday with another great guest. Have a great weekend. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The truth is here and now on WLTKDB Talk Radio at WLTKDB.com.